Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. Our marriage didn't end with a scream or a slammed door. It ended with a whisper. Four quiet, simple, and utterly devastating words spoken in the dim, gray light of a Tuesday morning. For 10 years, my life with Clara was a study in comfortable, quiet partnership. I am a quiet man by nature. My name is Arthur, and I work as a sound engineer for an audiobook company. My world is a world of words, of nuance, of the subtle emotional texture of a human voice. I am a professional listener, a man who is paid to understand the meaning behind the sound. Clara was a trial lawyer. Her world was loud, adversarial, a world of conflict and argument. I thought we balanced each other. I was the calm, steady harbor to her stormy, brilliant sea. Our home was my sanctuary, the one place where the noise of the world was muted, where I could simply be. Our love, I believed, was the silent, foundational track upon which the louder, more chaotic soundtrack of our lives was built. It was a love that was understood, not shouted. It was in the small daily rituals, the way I would make her coffee every morning exactly how she liked it. The way she would always, without fail, text me at lunch just to say hello. It was a quiet, dependable, and deeply reassuring love. Or so I believed. The cracks in that foundation had been forming for a long time, I see that now. But they were hairline fractures, the kind you don't notice until the entire structure begins to groan under the strain. Her work became more demanding, her hours longer. The brilliant, passionate advocate I had married was slowly being replaced by a tired, irritable, and increasingly distant stranger. The quiet, easy silences between us, which had once been comfortable, became heavy, fraught with unspoken tensions. Our small, happy rituals began to fray at the edges. The good-night kisses became a perfunctory peck on the cheek. The lunchtime texts became less frequent, then stopped altogether. I told myself it was just a phase, a stressful case she was working on, the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. I was a man who believed in weathering the storm, in the patient, steady work of maintenance and repair. I was a fool. I was a man trying to patch a crack in a wall, not realizing that the entire foundation of the house was crumbling beneath my feet. The morning it ended was an ordinary morning. It was a Tuesday. It was raining, a soft, persistent drizzle that seemed to match the gray, muted tone of our life together. She was getting ready for work, a whirlwind of sharp, anxious energy in the quiet space of our bedroom. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, watching her, a familiar, dull ache of a feeling I had come to know as loneliness in my chest. She was struggling with the clasp of a necklace, her fingers fumbling, her frustration a palpable static charge in the air. "I can't get this damn thing," she muttered, her voice a low, angry growl. It was a small, ordinary moment, a moment where, for 10 years, I would have stood up, walked over to her, and my familiar, steady hands would have fixed the problem. It was a part of our language, our quiet, physical shorthand. It was a small act of service, of love. I stood up. I walked over to her, my hands already reaching for the small silver clasp. I was the husband, the partner, the man who fixes things. And then, as my fingers brushed against the warm skin of her neck, she flinched. A violent, full-body flinch, as if my touch had been a jolt of electricity, an open flame. She pulled away from me, her back hitting the cold, hard wood of the dresser. Her eyes, when they met mine in the mirror, were wide and hard and full of a cold, clear, and utterly unfamiliar emotion. It was not frustration. It was not anger. It was a kind of profound and deeply wounding revulsion. And then she spoke the words, the four quiet and perfectly chosen words that would become the epitaph of our marriage. "Don't touch me," she said. Her voice was not a shout. It was a whisper, a cold, flat, and utterly final whisper. There was the sound of a door being quietly and irrevocably locked. I stood there, my hands frozen in the air. The echo of her words, a physical, concussive force in the silent room. Don't touch me. It was not a request. It was a verdict. It was a judgment. It was a final, unappealable ruling from the highest court in the land of our marriage, and she was the sole and final judge. In that single, terrible moment, the last, flimsy, and beautifully constructed lie of my life was stripped away. The lie that we were just in a rough patch. The lie that my patience, my quiet, steady love would be enough to fix what was broken. I saw the truth in the cold, hard reflection of her eyes in the mirror. She did not just not love me anymore. She could not bear the touch of me. I was not her husband. I was a stranger, a contaminant, a presence in her life that was so unwelcome, so repellent, that the simple accidental brush of my skin against hers was an act of violation. The man I had been, the quiet, patient, and endlessly hopeful husband, died in that moment. He simply ceased to exist. In his place was a new and unfamiliar man, a man who was cold and quiet and suddenly, completely, and blessedly free. I did not argue. I did not plead. I did not ask for an explanation. To do so would have been to legitimize the verdict, to accept the role of the supplicant, the beggar at the gates of her affection. I was a man who had just been, in no uncertain terms, fired from the job of being her husband, and I had too much pride to ask for my old job back. I simply and quietly lowered my hands. I looked at her reflection in the mirror one last time, and then I turned, and I walked out of the room. I did not slam the door. I did not make a sound. I walked down the stairs of the house we had bought together. I walked past the photographs on the wall, the smiling, happy ghosts of a life that was now officially over. I went to the closet by the front door. I took my coat. I took my wallet. I took the keys to my car. I did not pack a bag. I did not take anything else. The life in this house was no longer mine. I was a ghost, and it is the duty of a ghost to know when it is time to depart. I walked out the front door, into the soft, gray, and strangely cleansing rain. I did not look back. I got in my car, I started the engine, and I drove. I had no destination. I had no plan. I was just a man, following the only instruction that had been given to me. Don't touch me. So I had removed myself, my touch, my presence, my entire inconvenient and now clearly repellent self from her life. It was the last and only act of love I had left to give her, the act of my own complete and total disappearance. The first 24 hours were a blur of motion and a profound internal stillness. I drove without a destination, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the hypnotic, rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. The world outside the car was a smear of gray and green, a watercolor painting of a life that was no longer mine. Inside the car, there was only the hum of the engine and the deafening, roaring silence in my own head. The 4 words she had spoken were on a loop, a piece of audio I was forced to master and remix in the studio of my own mind. Don't touch me. It was not just a rejection of my physical presence. It was a rejection of my entire being. It was a retroactive erasure of 10 years of shared history, of a love I had believed to be the one solid, load-bearing wall in the architecture of my life. That wall was now a pile of dust. I was a man in free fall, and I had no idea where the ground was. I drove for 6 hours until the city was a distant memory, a bad dream. I ended up in a small, forgotten town on the coast, a place where the air smelled of salt and decay, a place that seemed to match the landscape of my own internal world. I found a cheap, anonymous motel, a place of peeling paint and the faint, lingering scent of 1,000 other transient sorrows. I paid for a week in cash. The room was a perfect beige box of nothingness. And in that box, I began the slow, agonizing, and necessary work of taking inventory. I had the clothes on my back. I had the wallet in my pocket with a few $100s and a collection of credit cards that were, I knew, inextricably linked to her. And I had my phone. The phone was a small, black, and incredibly dangerous object. It was a lifeline to the world I had just left, and it was a tether that I knew I had to cut. I sat on the edge of the stiff polyester bedspread, and I held the phone in my hand. It was a Pandora's box of potential pain. I knew it would be full of her messages, her calls, apologies, explanations, accusations. I did not know. And I realized with a new and strangely empowering sense of clarity that I did not want to know. Her reasons, her justifications, her narrative of our ending, it was all just noise. The only signal that mattered was the one she had already sent, the one that was as clear and as unambiguous as a flat line on a heart monitor. Don't touch me. I did not need a translation. I did not need an interpretation. I just needed to accept the data. I turned the phone off. I opened the window of the motel room, and I threw the phone, with all of its ghosts, all of its potential noise, into the dumpster in the alley below. The sound it made as it hit the bottom was a small, pathetic, and deeply satisfying thud. It was the sound of a door closing. My first real and proactive step into my new and utterly silent life. The days that followed were a study in the art of being no one. I was a man without a past, without a future, without a digital footprint. I bought a cheap, untraceable prepaid phone. I went to a thrift store and bought a few changes of clothes that were not the clothes of a quiet, respectable librarian, but the clothes of a ghost, of a man who did not want to be seen. I took a job, a simple, physical, and blessedly anonymous job. I became a dishwasher in a greasy waterfront diner, a place that was a constant, chaotic symphony of clattering plates, of shouting cooks, of the hiss of the grill. For the first time in my life, I welcomed the noise. It was a shield. It was a wall of sound that kept the silence in my own head at bay. The work was hard. It was hot. It was mindless. And it was a kind of salvation. The physical exhaustion at the end of a 12-hour shift was a clean, honest, and welcome feeling. It left no room for the ghosts, no energy for the endless, circular, and deeply unproductive work of mourning a life that had been a lie. I was not Arthur, the husband, the listener, the fixer. I was just Art, the quiet guy who washed the dishes, the guy who kept his head down, who did his work, who spoke only when spoken to. I was a man who was systematically and deliberately erasing himself. And in that erasure, I began to find a strange and unexpected kind of peace. I did not know what had happened after I had walked out that door. I did not allow myself to wonder. She was a character in a book I had finished reading. The book was closed. It was back on the shelf. I was now in a new and completely different library. One night, about a month into my new monastic existence, a man sat down at the counter of the diner. He was a fisherman, his face a testament to a life lived in the sun and the salt, his hands as rough and as calloused as my own were now becoming. We were the only two people in the place, besides the night cook. He ordered a coffee, and we just sat there, in the quiet, comfortable silence of two men who understood the value of not speaking. "Rough seas tonight," he finally said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Yeah," I said. "Looks that way." He took a sip of his coffee. "You new in town?" he asked. "Just passing through," I said, the lie of familiar and now comfortable second skin. He just nodded. "A lot of people are just passing through here," he said, his eyes on the dark, churning water of the harbor outside the window. "It's a good place for it, a good place to get your bearings before you decide which way you're headed next." He finished his coffee. He put a few dollars on the counter, and he stood up to leave. "You know," he said, pausing at the door, "my deckhand quit on me last week. The sea, it's not for everyone. But if a man is looking for a place to put his back into some real, honest work, well, the offer is there." He didn't wait for a reply.
He just nodded and he was gone. I sat there at the counter long after he had left. The offer. It was a simple and probably desperate offer from a man who was short-handed. But to me, it felt like something more. It felt like a sign, a map, a direction. The sea. It was a world that was even louder, even more elemental, even more unforgiving than the kitchen of this diner. It was a world that had no room for the quiet, contemplative, and deeply wounded man I used to be. It was a world that demanded all of you, your strength, your focus, your will. The next morning, I did not go to the diner. I walked down to the docks.
I found his boat, a small, sturdy, and deeply unromantic fishing trawler named the Resolute. He was there, mending a net, his hands moving with a slow, practiced, and deeply ancient rhythm. He looked up as I approached. He did not look surprised. "I thought you might show up," he said. "The pay is terrible," I said. "The hours are worse," he agreed, a small, grim smile on his face. "And the coffee is a damn sight worse than what they serve in that diner." I stood there for a long moment, the salt spray in the air, a clean, sharp, and invigorating scent. I looked out at the vast, gray, and unknowable expanse of the ocean. It was a world with no maps, no easy answers, no guarantees. It was a world of profound and deeply terrifying freedom. "When do we start?" I asked. The sea did not offer me salvation. It offered me a different, more profound, and far more honest kind of purgatory. The life of a deckhand on a commercial fishing boat is a brutal, relentless, and deeply humbling education in the art of survival. The work was a physical agony that transcended anything I had ever known. My body, the soft, indoor body of a sound engineer, was broken down and rebuilt by the sheer, grinding reality of hauling nets, of gutting fish, of fighting the constant, violent motion of the boat for 16 hours a day. The exhaustion was so complete, so absolute, that it was a form of enlightenment. It burned away the last, lingering ghosts of my old life. There is no room for heartbreak when your hands are bleeding and your back is a single continuous fire of pain. My captain, a man named Silas, was a man of few words and a deep elemental wisdom. He was not my therapist, he was my boss. He taught me the language of the sea, the knots, the tides, the subtle signs in the sky that foretold a coming storm. He did not care about my past. He cared only about my ability to do the work, to pull my weight, to be a functional and not a fatal part of the small, fragile ecosystem of his boat. For 2 years, this was my life. I was no longer a husband, no longer a librarian, no longer a ghost. I was a fisherman. I was a man who worked with his hands, who lived by the rhythms of the ocean, who was a part of something real and elemental and true. The silence in my own heart, which had once been a screaming empty void, was now filled with the roar of the waves, the cry of the gulls, the steady, reassuring thrum of the boat's diesel engine. I had found a new and louder kind of peace. I did not think of Clara, or rather, I learned to think of her in a different way. She was no longer a source of pain. She was a historical fact, a closed chapter in a book about a man I no longer was. I did not hate her. I did not forgive her. I simply accepted. Her words, "Don't touch me," had not been a curse. They had been a key. They had unlocked a door out of a life that had been, I now realized, a quiet, comfortable, and deeply confining prison. She had not pushed me out. She had, in her own cruel and ultimately liberating way, set me free. The decision to go back was not a decision to go back to her. It was a decision to go back to myself. After 2 years at sea, I had saved a small but respectable amount of money. I had paid my dues. I had served my time in the wilderness, and a quiet, persistent yearning for a different kind of life, a life on solid ground, began to take root in me. I was not the same man who had fled in the rain. I was harder, stronger, quieter. The sea had weathered me, had stripped away the non-essential parts of me, leaving only the solid, unbreakable core. I said goodbye to Silas on the docks of that small coastal town that had been my accidental sanctuary. He did not ask where I was going. He just shook my hand, his grip like a vice. "The sea will always be here," he said, which was his way of saying, "You will always have a home." I drove, but this time I had a destination. I drove back to the city, to the life I had abandoned. I was not going back to reclaim a past. I was going to conduct a quiet, final, and necessary piece of business. I was going to get a divorce. I hired a lawyer, a young, sharp woman who specialized in uncontested separations. I had no idea where Clara was, if she had filed her own papers, if she had moved on. My only goal was to legally and formally close the book. The lawyer's search for her was surprisingly short. She was still in our house. She had never left. And according to the public records, she had never filed for a divorce. She had simply stayed. My lawyer sent the papers to the house, and then we waited for her response. Her response came not in the form of a legal document, but in the form of a phone call. To my lawyer. She did not contest the divorce. She did not want to negotiate the terms. She just wanted one thing. She wanted to see me. My lawyer advised against it. "It's a trap, Arthur," she had said. "She'll try to manipulate you, to play on your sympathies. There is no legal reason for you to meet with her." But my own internal compass was pointing in a different direction. This was not a legal matter. This was a human one. I needed to see her one last time. Not to fight, not to forgive, but to bear witness. To see the end of the story I had walked out of 2 years ago. I agreed to meet her, not in our house, not on my territory or on hers. We met in a neutral space, a quiet, anonymous coffee shop halfway between her world and mine. I arrived first. I sat at a small table in the back, and I waited. When she walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. The brilliant, sharp, and powerful trial lawyer was gone. The woman who stood in the doorway was a stranger. She was thinner, paler, her vibrant, confident energy replaced by a kind of fragile, almost transparent stillness. Her hair was pulled back in a simple, unadorned ponytail. She was wearing no makeup. She was a woman who had been stripped of all her armor. She saw me, and her eyes, those same hard and cold eyes that had met mine in the mirror on that terrible, final morning, were different now. They were full of a profound and deeply weary sorrow. She came and sat down opposite me. She did not speak for a long time. She just looked at me, her gaze a quiet, searching thing. "You look different," she finally said, her voice a soft, rusty whisper. "The sea does that to a man," I said. It was not an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "I got your papers," she said. "I'll sign them. I won't contest anything. The house, the assets, it's all yours. I don't want any of it." "I don't want it either," I said. "I just want to be free." She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "I know," she whispered. And then the story came out. Not in a rush, but in a slow, painful, and deeply honest confession. The man, the affair, had been a symptom, not the disease. The disease had been her life, her career, the crushing, relentless pressure of being the brilliant, successful, and utterly, completely, and terrifyingly empty Clara. The affair had been a desperate, foolish, and ultimately meaningless attempt to feel something, anything other than the profound and deeply secret loneliness of her own perfect life. "When you left," she said, her eyes not on me but on the untouched cup of coffee in front of her, "I thought at first that it was what I wanted, the silence, the space. But the silence, it wasn't empty, it was full. It was full of me. And I discovered that I was not very good company." She told me that the other man had been gone within a month. The thrill of the illicit, the drama of the affair had not survived the quiet, boring reality of a life without me, without the obstacle that had been the entire point of their rebellion. She had been left alone in the quiet, empty house with nothing but the echo of her own terrible and life-altering mistake.
I have spent 2 years, she said, her voice now just a ragged whisper, living with the ghost of the man who walked out that door. And I have learned, too late, that the one thing in my life that was ever truly real, that was ever truly worth anything, was his touch. She finally looked at me, and her eyes were full of tears. Tears that were not manipulative, not theatrical, tears that were real. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, she said. I know that I destroyed us. But I have to ask you one thing, Arthur. Not for me, but for the man I used to know, the man who was my friend. Is there any part of him left? I looked at her, at this broken, humbled, and finally honest woman, and the cold, hard, and unforgiving ice that had been in my heart for 2 years began for the first time to crack. The question hung in the air between us, a fragile and impossibly heavy thing. Is there any part of him left? She was not asking for a second chance. She was not asking for absolution. She was asking for a sign of life. A proof that the man she had destroyed was not, in fact, completely and utterly dead. I thought about the man I had been 2 years ago, the man who had walked out of that house and into the rain, the man who had been so consumed by his own righteous pain that he had chosen the clean, simple, and ultimately selfish path of complete erasure. The man who had thrown his phone in a dumpster, who had taken a new name, who had turned his back not just on her, but on the entire, messy, and complicated business of being human. And I thought about the man I was now, the man who had been broken down and rebuilt by the sea, the man who had learned the value of a hard day's work, of a quiet conversation with a stranger, of the simple, unthanked, and deeply necessary act of pulling your own weight. I don't know, I said, and it was the most honest thing I had said in a very long time. But I think I'm on my way to finding him. We sat in that coffee shop for another hour. We did not talk about the past. We did not talk about the future.
We talked about the present. I told her about the sea, about Silas, about the profound and deeply humbling education of the waves. She told me about her new, quiet life. She had left the law firm. She was working, pro bono, for a legal aid clinic, helping people who had no one else to fight for them. She was, in her own way, trying to pay a debt, to balance a ledger that was far more complex than any financial statement. We were two survivors, two people who had been shipwrecked by their own and each other's choices, and who were now, tentatively and cautiously, describing the different, lonely islands upon which we had washed ashore. There was no grand cinematic moment of forgiveness. There was no tearful reunion. The love story of Arthur and Clara was over. That book was closed. But as we stood up to leave, as we stood in the awkward, unbridged space between our two now separate lives, I did something I had not planned to do. I reached out, not for a hug, not for an embrace. I simply and gently placed my hand on her arm. It was a small, simple, and deeply human gesture, a gesture of acknowledgement, of shared history, of a pain that was, I now realized, not just mine, but ours. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. She just stood there, and for a fraction of a second she closed her eyes, and a single silent tear traced a path down her pale cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. And I knew she was not thanking me for my touch. She was thanking me for the proof that the man she had known, the man who fixes things, was not, after all, completely and utterly gone. We signed the papers the next day. The divorce was a quiet, legal formality, a final, necessary, and strangely painless amputation. We divided our assets, the material wreckage of our shared life, with a quiet and mutually respectful efficiency. I did not want the house. It was a place of ghosts, and I was done with ghosts. I took my half, a sum of money that felt like it belonged to a different man, from a different lifetime. My own future was a blank page, a map that was still being drawn. I did not go back to the sea.
The sea had done its work. It had been my purgatory, my monastery, my forge. It had made me the man I was now. But it was not my home. My home, I was beginning to realize, was not a place. It was a state of being. It was a state of quiet and honest and deeply felt work. I took the money, and I bought a small, failing, and deeply beautiful, independent bookstore in a quiet university town. A place of stories, a place of words, a place of quiet and order and a different kind of listening. I am a librarian again, of a sort, but I am not the same man. The man I am now is a man who understands that silence can be a weapon and it can be a medicine. He is a man who knows that some things, once broken, can never be perfectly repaired, but that there is a profound and deep and often beautiful strength in the scars. I see her sometimes. She comes into my store. She does not come to see me. She comes to buy books. We are polite. We are kind. We are two strangers who share a lifetime of secrets. We are two people who destroyed each other, and who, in the process, and against all odds, managed to save ourselves. Her final words to me on that terrible, transformative Tuesday morning had been a command: "Don't touch me." And for 2 years I had obeyed. I had built a new life on the foundation of that rejection. But in that final, quiet moment in the coffee shop, with the simple and unasked-for touch of my hand on her arm, I had given her a new and final command of my own, a command that was also a promise that was also a pardon. And the command was this: "You are forgiven. Now let go." And I believe, in my own quiet and deeply hopeful heart, that she finally and truly has. This was Reddit Whispers. We've all carried secrets and scars. What's the one story you wish more people understood about you? Let us know in the comments.